First, I want to address a theological question. So we're going to have theology time with Kevin this morning, just for a little while. A few weeks ago, when we were studying through the book of Amos, I mentioned there in Amos chapter 6 that God had told Amos, I'm going to send a plague of locusts and I'm going to send a drought on the land. And Amos prayed and he interceded, and it says that God changed his mind and he did not do that. And at that time I said, we don't have time to jump into what that means, but we'd come back to it. And knowing that we were going to be in Jonah, I knew I was going to come back to it at this time. Because when we get to Jonah chapter 4 and verse 1, it says that there was something that happened that greatly displeased Jonah. Because it says there in verse 10 of chapter 3 that God relented from what he was going to do. And so that brings that question to mind. Some of your translations may say that God changed his mind and did not do what he had declared. And so we ask that question, what does it mean for God to change his mind? It's a deep theological question. It gives people fits and has for generations of what does this mean? This question, again, concerns God's knowledge. More specifically, God's knowledge of conditional future contingents. Okay, I know that's like a big philosophical phrase, a big theological phrase. It's like, hang with me, right? Because we're going to explain this and illustrate this, and we're going to drive this point home. Like, what does it mean for God's knowledge of conditional future contingents, right? William Lane Craig defines it this way. It's God knowing what would happen if human beings were to make some free choices in particular sets of circumstances, right? In any set of circumstances that we find ourselves, God knows what we would freely choose to do in any situation, what we would do if he put us in that place, and what we would do freely. Not what he would compel us to do or force us to do, but what we would freely choose to do. God knows those, okay? Now let me illustrate this with a story from David's life. God told him, Saul is coming and the people will turn you over if you stay. If you leave, none of those things will happen. God knew both contingent futures. He knew the conditions of both futures. He knew what would actually happen if David stayed or what would actually happen if David left. So he knew both sets of contingent future plans. And it was depending on what David would do in his own free will once he heard the news. And he was free to make either choice. But God told him what would happen in both situations. And that's what God does for us in our life. He tells us what can happen in both situations, just as parents do for their children. If you do this, this is the consequence. If you don't do that, then you won't get that consequence.